Let me tell you a little bit about my background and how, for me anyway, in my mind, leadership and humanism are slightly linked. So leadership is the area that's my professional area of expertise, and humanism is my personal interest. I used to work at HUL, Hindustan Levers, Unilever, in the sales and marketing function. And I attended a leadership program, and I found that very impactful. It was really about how do you view the world, and like how your beliefs prevent you from being effective, etc. And that had a big impact on me, not just at work, but in all areas of my life. And so I said, that's what I want to be doing. And I went into the area of leadership development. I worked there for a while, then I started my own company, Stillwater, and we've been doing that since about 2011. So coaching the CEOs, a lot of the top companies in India, Urban Ladder, Pantaloons, Teach for India, etc., etc. And through that, I also got called to teach at ISB. So based on my training work, I teach at ISB. I'm a professor there. I teach communication, but I also teach ethics. They called me to do ethics programs over there. And I think that's a little bit where some of my interest in humanism comes in, because initially I was like, okay, why are people not doing the things that will make them effective, right? And we said, okay, these are some limiting beliefs people have that are preventing them from being more effective at work. And when we really look down at what are these beliefs, there are a lot of rules. I should be like this. I have to do this. I must do that. I can't do this, etc. So, for example, I have an idea, but if my boss says no, I'm feeling frustrated. Well, why don't you go and explain to your boss? Well, he's going to think I'm impertinent. Well, why do you think he's going to be, why do you think he's going to be upset? He might be very happy that you're coming with an idea. And then you'll find out that, the belief is that you should not talk back to elders. So they're holding back these ideas, right? Or they're shouting at the team because you should behave in a certain way, for example. And I found that these words, I should, I have to, I must, I need to, I can't, I'm supposed to. These are words that were kind of holding people back from doing the things they want. So they would never say, I want to do this, so this is what I'm going to do. This is what I want in my life. And so to make that happen, these are the things I'm going to do. It was always like, I should spend more time with my kids. I should exercise, etc. I'm like, why are you saying I should exercise? Why are you not saying I want to exercise, so I'm going to create this time? Oh, I can't do this. And if I really look at where these words are coming from, should, have to, can't, I felt like it's, when they're young, they're getting these messages, right, to keep them safe, right? And I think religion gives a lot of rules and guidance to keep people safe when they have not got enough experience to make their own decisions. But in a certain way, in my leadership work that I do professional, it's about getting people past these beliefs and say, okay, what do you want? Okay, what are the choices available? What are the pros and cons, right? What are your ethical boundaries for this? So what are you going to do? So what do you want? What are you going to do, as opposed to should, have to, can't? And I felt like a lot of the barriers that people get are from conventional thinking, a lot of that which comes from religion, right? And so in our training work, we don't say this explicitly because we don't want to say, oh, we're anti-religion, etc. In the corporate world, a lot of our participants are obviously religious people. But our philosophy is really, we're going to use logic. So if there's something you want to create in life, there's some outcome you want to create, rather than, praying or gurus, etc. We're going to say, okay, logically, what do you need to do? Let's break this out. Let's look at the logic you're applying to solve the problem. What are the fallacies in the logic? Let's figure that out, rather than what is the right or wrong thing to do ethically. I'm also a professor in ethics at ISB. Let's figure out what you want. What is the impact going to be on other people? So you say this, like for homosexuality is wrong, for example, according to religion. Well, why is it wrong? And, let's look at ethics from the point of view of it's ethical if it's not harming other people. It's unethical if it's harming other people. You're violating their fundamental rights. So both and again, the reason that people were not following this idea of ethics about harm. Are you harming somebody or not? That's an unethical. Instead, it's like, oh, what am I wearing? What am I eating? How many times a day I'm praying? So a lot of things that have nothing to do with ethics, like what you're wearing, I would say it's got nothing to do with ethics because you're not harming anybody else. That got into the place. I saw religion coming and making a whole bunch of arbitrary rules. I saw it getting in the way of people's effectiveness in their work by giving these arbitrary rules and kind of like these narrow constraints that they could operate within. I also found that people were constantly feeling guilty and not good enough. And I think a lot of that is this idea of sin and, doing things the right way, etc. So a lot of guilt, if I feel like I'm not doing the right thing, the thing I'm supposed to, like a lot of anger with other people who are not behaving in the way that I think they should. That's getting in the way of relationships. It's getting in the way of effectiveness. It's getting in the way of, ethics, etc. So that was one side in my professional space that I found humanism coming in. And now, within our team, it's very explicit. 3 values of humanism that we're trying to get through in our teachings is use evidence-based rationality for your decisions, so logic. Use empathy in your relationships, right? Not what is right or wrong, it's a divine command, but empathy and personal responsibility. So what are the choices that I'm making? What is working, what's not working? What are the choices that I made that contributed to this negative outcome? What are the choices that I want to make now to fix it, etc.? So rather than waiting for a savior or a guru or prayer or astrology, my choices are determining the outcomes. And so that's the focus we have in our professional work. In the personal work, I got interested in humanism because of 2002, the riots in Gujarat. I came back to India from the UK. I did my engineering essay in UK. I came back in 2001, and immediately after I came, 2002 happened, and I was really angry at that time. And at that time, a lot of people were very angry. So the news at that time about the Modi's riots in Gujarat was like, hey, what is this guy doing, etc. On the Time of India cover, etc. It was like very critical articles of him. And so I forgot it. Okay, it happened in one state. That's a crazy state. It's not going to happen to the rest of India. But as 2013 came, and it was clear that he is more likely to get elected. Until then, I had always thought of religion as a benign, thing. Some people believe in crazy things. Okay, fine. Like they want to pray, they ring bells. It's fine. How are they harming anybody else? Then I started saying, okay, you got 9/11 and 2002, etc. All these kind of things. So there's some crazy people who do crazy things, but the vast majority of people in general, they're pretty harmless. But when it came that this guy got elected as a prime minister of India, and some hundreds of millions of people voted for him, and they turned a blind eye to the things that everybody else in the world clearly knows have been happening over there. That convinced me that religion has the ability to blind a very large segment of the population and create a lot of corruption as well in a country. And why do I feel that? Because why would somebody not vote for an honest person, right? Why would somebody not vote for a capable, honest person? Why does anybody vote for people who don't have capability or integrity? The only reason people say, okay, that's less important is because they think this person represents a worldview that matches mine. He's going to look out for us. So then I'm going to choose religion or religious identification over capability and integrity. And when you have people in a country the size of India who are doing that, it really damages the poor people, especially because the decisions are really not the most well thought out ones necessarily. Not atheism anymore, because I realized that even atheism, there are obviously the communist regimes in Russia and China, etc., who've done lots of human rights violations. There are Americans who've dropped the nuclear bomb on Japan, etc. So you can be an atheist and still be an nationalist person who's violent. You can still be a communist person who's violent. Even if you don't believe in gods, you can believe in a lot of other non-scientific things like aliens, or not that aliens are non-scientific, but Yeti, etc. So it is, for me, it was like, okay, atheism by itself is not necessarily the answer to religious bigotry. You could have the Nazis who are very rational and very logical, and they're using their logic and rationality to build engineering systems to kill people on a mass scale. They're designing engineering to put gases to commit genocide of Jews, etc. So just atheism by itself, even though it's I am an atheist, by itself it's not enough. You've also got to have human rights, the value of human rights above everything else, right? Above communism, above nationality, above religion. And so then I said, hey, around in India, we've got no humanism. Nobody knows what it is. Some people know maybe what atheism is, but nobody really understands humanism, the whole idea of human rights. And when I started reading these stories about Gujarat and the people who had suffered in these situations, the women who were raped, the children who were killed and burnt alive, etc., and I was like, if somebody killed my children, I would just be devastated for the rest of my life. And if nobody in the country looked at that and said anything, my life would just turn ashen. So how can I, knowing that this has happened, remain silent when if it happened to me, that would be the end of my life? And so if the educated people are not going to speak vociferously, even at the risk of unpopularity, against these things, how is that change going to come? It's not happening through education, because the education minister is Smriti Irani, fake degrees, spouting religion, using all that. So if the people we're electing on the basis of religion are going to not put in a scientific agenda, how is the society going to change? It's only going to be educated professionals like me and you who can see what's going on, and then we have a choice about whether to speak or not. And so personally, I started, writing, blogging about these sort of things, and what I was seeing. And we got a bit of following, 120,000 people on the Indian Enlightenment website, etc. And so that's where I got into a lot of conversations with people, a lot of arguments, a lot of death threats, etc., from people who were unhappy at what I was saying, etc. And so that's a little bit about how these two areas, my professional area of leadership and then ethics and communication, came towards humanism, and then how my interest as a citizen of what was going on in India slowly brought me back, through atheism and then to humanism. And now, I guess at this point in my life, what I'm really looking for is how can I, expand the number of people who know about humanism, who understand, how it's different and how it's applicable in potentially making India a much better place to live in for everybody. And that's a very long-term goal. Obviously, it's going to take 50, 100 years, but just to start the conversation and create that trickle effect. So that's a little bit about why I got interested into humanism. And I would say, I'm not going to give much of a speech because although people think I'm a public speaker or a professional speaker, I'm actually a professional listener, I would say. So my job is not to get up on stage and speak for a long period of time and give gyan. I always feel scared that I'm saying stuff that is very blatantly obvious to the people who are listening. So I hate doing that. My job is really listening to people, hearing them talk through a problem and identifying their thinking gaps or logical mistakes. So then when I give feedback, I can say, hey, you're trying to achieve this. I feel like this is getting in the way. This action will lead to this result. So my job is listening, understanding, and sharing my feedback on very specific things. So I'm not going to give any more gyan as such. It would be great to hear from you guys, having shared my background. What are the thoughts or questions that you have, and I can share my perspective on some of those questions or thoughts that you guys have.
I have recently come across an article in TED which said that a single person's empathy is limited. At a time, you can empathize with probably one or two persons, or maybe some those persons. So how do you think the factor called empathy is going to have a big share of humanity? Since a single person's empathy is actually limited technically. Do you agree with it, first of all? And if it is that, so how is empathy going to spread all over the world?
Now, that's certainly been my experience. So I think my empathy is limited. And I think there was for a while when I found myself overwhelmed by all the suffering that's out there, like the people who were killed and stuff. I would find myself literally feeling very, very sad for long periods of time. And I came to the conclusion that, you can't change the world. Gandhi has tried, Buddha has tried. There are a lot of people, Ambedkar, Nehru, there are a lot of very, very great people and, who've lost their lives and lived their entire lives and spent, decades in jail trying to change the world for the better. And they've been doing it for the last 4,000 years, right? So one person cannot have the expectation on themselves that, okay, I'm going to get really passionate about something and things are going to change over. If you believe that, you're going to wear yourself out. And it's like taking a drop of water or bucket of water. If you throw it into the Sahara and that's your empathy, there's just so much heat out there, it'll burn and evaporate and you'll be left with nothing. It's much better, I feel, to say, okay, this is a plot of land. Here's one plant and I've got a bucket of water. Let me nurture this plant. Right? Let me nurture this plant. And so identifying what is my circle of influence or circle of concern. This is the people I can do. My driver, I'm going to make sure that I pay his salary for a year. He's not been working. He's been at his home. He might even have a second income, but he kind of like, I'm responsible for him. Like we've got Vishal over here. I don't want to sack him during COVID, etc. I'm going to make sure that we keep employing him, finding things for him. We've got a lot of people that we can work with, people who I coach at people who I can do some NGO work. So let me make sure that the people that I can influence in that circle, I do what I can, and then be cognizant, be cognizant of the larger thing, but not let that affect me on a day-to-day basis. Be cognizant of it. Vote. Vishal saying thanks for not sacking you in the chat box. Vote for the people you believe are upholding the values of humanism. Make a point publicly about what you see, what you're thinking. Be honest about that. But there are some people who are activists and there are some people who are not, and there are values to both. So you find your circle of influence, how you're bringing up your kids, how you're treating the people who work with you, who work for you, the people who you can influence, and really show empathy there. And be cognizant of it, but I think you've got a limit as well, because if you just spread it, I found that it's very exhausting. It's not realistic, and it's a little bit of a Jesus complex. Like, I can change the entire world if I care enough. You're going to burn yourself out, and it's not going to work. So yeah, I think you do need to constrain while being conscious of the larger implications as well.
In this pandemic, we have reports of women leadership leading all the way countries. So we have reports from New Zealand, we have reports from Belgium, Denmark, Germany, where all women, Iceland even, women leaders have taken it on to managing pandemic with all the courage and the might. So how do you view the data-based veracity of such claims and observations in particular, where women have actually led in the time of pandemic? And do you think the leadership landscape all over the world is kind of changing in favor of women, especially during this pandemic? How do you view that?
I don't think it's changing, especially in terms of the pandemic, but I think that it is changing in general. So it's not just in the pandemic. It's, the CEOs of Pepsi and, Citi. I think yesterday they were the first large investment bank to have a woman CEO, etc. So that's changing just generally. The pandemic may be showing it, but it's not happening because of the pandemic, or this is not an opportunity in the pandemic. It's just a general trend where women are, becoming more empowered, understanding what they're capable of, and the opportunities are opening up. I think the data is too small to say that, women are better leaders than men. It's like five people, we might say just now. It's too small a data sample. And you could equally say, okay, this woman has done a great job, so has this man. You could say, KK Shailaja has done a great job. You could say Pinarayi has also done a great job, like one woman, one man. You could say Merkel or Jacinda has done it. You could say Trudeau is doing a good job in Canada. So I don't think it's like, this is a woman and that's why she's done a good job and women are better leaders than others. They've done a good job because they're smart, intelligent, and capable people. There are men who've done good jobs because they're smart, intelligent people. And in India, if you had, Smriti Irani or Kangana Ranaut running the country, and that's not impossible, they would not necessarily be making such great decisions. So I think rather than saying it's because of their gender or in spite of the gender, the way I see it in humanism, it's irrelevant. Gender is irrelevant in determining the performance. Women are equally as good as men. Men are equally as good as women, and we don't need to make a case for why women are better leaders or worse leaders. We just treat that as an irrelevant thing. Their capability is what should determine that. I feel like the reason that there is a high correlation, let me say, it's not necessarily causation, is because women will be elected in countries that are more liberal, that are less conservative, that are more science-based, etc. So, in a New Zealand or Canada, etc., you're going to have women leaders, and those kind of countries with those kind of values are going to make scientific decisions and based on logic and empathy, etc. So I would say it's a correlation that the culture of a country is both going to determine whether they have a woman PM or whether they have decent response to COVID. But it's not necessarily the women are causing the good response. They are both emergent properties of the underlying culture that they've had. In Saudi Arabia, you're not going to get a woman leader, or Iran, you're not going to get that, and they're going to make decisions that are more based on religious considerations and etc. So I think that in answer to your question, Hari, I think that the situation of women is changing in all areas in the world, and that in the pandemic you will see that in continuation, but it's not being caused by the pandemic. And the correlation between women doing well, it's interesting, and it shows a larger trend, but it's not because they're women. I don't think we need to say women are better or worse. They're just smart, capable people.
I would just like to ask if there is a similar difference in terms of a religious leader versus a secular leader. We talked about women versus men leaders, but is it the same in case of religious leaders versus a secular leader or a leader of an atheist organization or a place? How does religio-political views affect the various settings in terms of leadership?
in general for the worse, I think, because people are going to be making decisions, one, on the basis of, okay, not good people are going to be protected by God, bad people are going to be punished by God. So as long as I pray and I'm a good person, God will look after me. Or if I pray, I can ward this off because, I'm a good person, I'm a devout person, etc. That belief is not going to stand against reality. And we've seen a lot of infections happening at religious grounds, places like Iran, or in the religious festivals in India, etc. So we've seen it in lots of places. In America, we see a lot of the Christian right is saying, hey, you know what, I'm not going to wear these face masks. God intended me to breathe in a certain way. To put a face mask is going against the will of God. It's sort of like how Sikhs say you can't cut your hair because, God intended us to be this way, or etc., etc. You have these people saying we should not put a face mask because that's not what God intended. So you have a lot of pseudoscientific claims in India about, cow dung will protect you from coronavirus, and dodgy cure thrown by Patanjali, and Ayurveda, and not all of Ayurveda, but like lots of dodgy stuff being sold, snake oil. And so in general, you're going to have religious people not making decisions only on the basis of science. There's going to be a lot of inconsequential considerations, and so on average the decision making is going to be worse when fighting something like COVID. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have like less religious countries necessarily making fantastic decisions, because if you look at the first part of China, they're a communist country, highly atheistic, but they suppress the news. They kind of like, punish the people who are talking about it. They want it to look good. So again, just because you're atheist doesn't mean you're necessarily going to make the best decisions. Any place where there's authoritarianism, any place where there's suppression of free speech, any place where you've got a limited group of people who are trying to preserve their power and they don't want bad news going out, whether they're atheist or religious, will also make bad decisions there. So on average, I would say, even countries like America, there may be people who are saying, I won't wear a mask, not because of religious reasons, just that I believe that I have the right to not let other people dictate to me what I can do with my personal choice. It's my choice to wear a mask. Other people don't like it. That's their decision. They can't tell me. So even something like fundamental human rights, coming even from a complete humanist, they might have a different point of view and say, I refuse to wear a mask. It is my right to wear a mask. Nothing to do with religion, right? So on the whole, I would say that religion does make worse decisions, but just because I'm not religious doesn't necessarily mean I'm making the best decisions in terms of how to fight this. There can be a whole bunch of other reasons as well, and we've seen that in China and other places as well.
Now, coming back to India, we have this Article 51AH, fundamental rights, which says that we have to promote scientific temper and humanism in the country. Despite of that, a large part of India is still religious, and we are also conservative, and that's taking a hit a lot on the scientific temper. So, where do you think, or when do you think there might be actually a tipping point for our society to be more scientific society and secular-oriented society?
I think the internet is going to accelerate it, because I think although it's there in our constitution that we need to be, encouraging scientific temper, and that's one of our fundamental duties, nobody has been in a place where they can challenge religion in India. There's no politician who will speak against it, no public person who will speak against it, because the film goers are religious, your voters are religious. You can't put that in your syllabuses, in education syllabuses, and people are going to learn what their parents taught them in their houses, and they're never going to hear anything that contradicts that until now, until, say 1995, where we start getting onto the internet. And now for the first time, you're not just getting teachers speaking conventional stuff. You're not just seeing stuff in newspapers from politicians, etc., saying nothing that criticizes religion. You're not just listening to your parents. Now you have access to a whole world, and you hear the Hitchens lectures. You hear the Dawkins debates. You see people posting things against religion. That makes you angry. That makes you fight. So there's a lot of argument just now, but it's the first time that India is really being exposed to this. In America, for a long time, the levels of religiosity were much higher than in Europe, and they had a very much Christian fundamental base. But since the internet took off and the new atheists came out, those debates have slowly made people, come into contact with atheistic views. debates have come up. There's been a lot of anger. But as they've been exposed over the generations, the people, the old people are going to believe what they believe. But the new people who are coming in and looking, okay, there's some religious stuff on the internet, there's some, atheist or humanist stuff, that looks more sensible. So you're not going to get people to shift, but one generation to next, when the next generation picks which paradigm to look through the world, they will change, right? And so in America, in the last decade or so, suddenly, after obviously thousands of years, but like centuries in America, you had a very Christian persistence, right? That has really collapsed in the last 10 years. And I think in India, as the bandwidth increases, as internet reaches more rural level, as people become, exposed to these ideas, there's going to be a lot of anger initially. But over a period of time, I think it's inevitable that new people coming on and seeing both these worldviews, one person saying, oh, let's cover ourselves up in cow dung, and one person saying, no, that's unrealistic. We need to get a vaccine, et cetera, et cetera. When new people are coming in and they're seeing more and more of this debate, slowly, we'll see the shift. So I do see it's happening. And I think, it's definitely happening. Because of social media, we get a lot more debate, and religion is now used to kind of motivate people in a way that hasn't been done there. But I think the underlying trend, even though the noise is all about religion, is definitely people are moving away from it in India, and that will accelerate, I feel, as we go forward.
In the Nordic countries, we have a whole lot of atheist Nordic countries, at least where atheists form a larger section of the population.
Yeah.
So, do you think that the wealth status achieved by these countries have made it better to pursue atheism for the people, the living conditions? And then because of the wealth status, people gradually started moving away from the religion. So I think your previous answer was also in the lines that whenever people are having good information and good wealth status, they tend to dip towards atheism. Is that the view you are maintaining for the Nordic countries as well? How did atheism get propagated in those European areas?
Yeah, I think they reinforce each other. So as you increase the wealth of a country, they can afford better social service, so you're less dependent on other people to survive. You don't have to listen to your kaka and kaki, etc. You can make your own decisions. The education levels improve. The capitalism and industries mean that you have to train people to be ready to do a higher level jobs like IT, etc. That higher level of thinking creates more critical thinking, which would create less religiosity. But at the same time, less religiosity means you're more open to new ideas and therefore scientific thinking and innovation, etc. So I think they both reinforce each other in a certain way. It's not like one solely causes the other or the other way around. A causes B, B causes A, and it goes around in a cycle. I think the research indicates that, I think somebody's done the research and I don't know what it is, but they looked at some measures of values, and they found that actually the change in values became more liberal just before the wealth creation happened. So based on that research, which I cannot quote and tell you about, but I read somewhere that somebody's done research and they felt that the liberal areas created those opportunities. And to give you an example, for example, in America, the big change in women's rights happened because of birth control, right? So in the 1960s or 1970s, they had the birth control pill that allowed women to choose when they become pregnant, right? Because they can delay when they become mothers, they can have sex outside marriage, they can have premarital sex, etc. They can go into the job, etc., and not worry about one sex and I have to become a mother. That empowered women, and that came from science. Science came because they were beginning to question the religious doctrines that God cause everything. Let's find the cause. Science, therefore engineering, technology, create the women freedom. The women empowerment movement means they can go into work, they can go to colleges, the education level goes further, the number of children goes down because they don't want to have 10 children, they can control the number of children, they control the number of children, more money to spend on their education, those kids go to college, etc. So it's really, and therefore become less religious, etc. So it starts off, I think, with an opening of the mindset about let's challenge the religious beliefs that women cannot work, for example, and that will create a whole bunch of stuff. So I feel that if we were to do the analysis, we'd find probably people become slightly more liberal first, that liberal creates openness and possibility and options for creativity and open thinking, which creates innovation and wealth, which then creates, the requirement for better IT jobs, etc., which creates more critical thinking, which again reduces religion, and then it goes on. But I think if you really look down at the beginning, it's probably you can only start thinking, questioning in a scientific way or critical thinking way if you start doubting the truths that you've been told. So I think it's if I was to say push me and force me to like find a cause, I think it's when we get past religion, then we can create wealth. Unless you're Saudi Arabia and you have like 5 trillion barrels of oil underneath your surface, then you can get wealth by just digging.
What do you think that is bizarre in India with the right wing when compared to the right wing of the West?
I think it's just lower education levels, and we're just, I think, further behind on the development cycle. So, like America has been a democracy, a republic since 1776. India has been there since 1947. So they've had effectively 300 years more of democracy. Britain has had their movements for rights and, the Magna Charta in like 1200 or something like that, I think. So they've had like 800 years of people like protesting their rights and so on. So I think we're further behind. And if you think about it, my dad was born like in 1947. We've really been independent for just one generation. If you think how long it takes us to change our beliefs, it changed. My dad believes something, I'll believe something, my kids will believe something, etc. Several generations, slowly, I think will become more, liberal, more progressive, etc. But we're expecting the changes in India. We can't compare. I feel like, there's a small percentage of us, the top 10, 1%, 10% of Indians who may be very fluent in English, who may be reading all the internet, who are exposed to exactly the same information as the top 10% in America. The remaining 90% in India, they don't know who the humanist philosophers are. They don't know about the Enlightenment. They don't know about that. They know going to the mandir, going to the temple, etc. So I think in countries with less education, higher religiosity, a lower history of time where we've been learning, it's comparing like a newborn baby to a very 300-year-old democratic system. I don't think it's comparable. I think for us, we should say, okay, what is the next step for us? We can't compare ourselves to there, but where do we go? Okay, they might have like 30% like people who are non-religious, etc. We might have like 5%. Okay, we need to get from 5% to 10%. And as we do that, slowly things will improve, right? So I feel like the alt-right movement is showing up in lots of different places, in Turkey, China in a very different way, in Brazil, in America, in Burma, etc. So there's a lot of cultural mismatch, and I think that's coming because since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the only system that is now effectively considered legitimate is the capitalist system. So earlier it was like a battle between communism and capitalism. So from 1991, last 30 years, what we've had is pretty much capitalism is the way to go. And that creates inequality. And when some people see some people who are much, much richer than them, they say, why are these people so much richer? And they could either say, well, actually, it's because we're not paying taxes. Or they can say, hey, actually, it's because those immigrants are coming and stealing your jobs. Actually, the rich people are getting the immigrants because they can get like cheaper labor and more profits. But now, because of the inequality, people are looking for, why am I poor? And the answer they've been given is immigrants or that community, et cetera, et cetera. So we're seeing a greater right-wing reaction to, I think, the growing inequalities, and that's what they see as the solution. I think eventually people are going to figure out it's taxes. When you take the taxes from the rich, you fund it in education and healthcare, like the Nordic countries, like Kerala to a large extent has done compared to the other states in India. You're going to get a much higher educated people who know their rights and who are less likely to be subjugated or be exploited, etc. And then people will understand fundamental human rights. But that comes from education, and education comes from money being spent on education, and that comes from a tax system where people say, no, we need to change. So just now, I think the solution people are finding to their poverty, etc., is immigrants and Muslims and those foreigners, etc. It's actually the tax system that has failed because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and therefore the predominance of only one ideology in the world of, So I think it's all linked, basically. Yeah.
Since leadership is your major topic, Could you enlighten us about the styles of the leadership followed by various leaders among the world? We have leaders like Putin, we have leaders like Trump, Modi, and each of these leaders will be having a certain kind of style, external style of leadership. We have somebody who is charismatic, somebody who is transformational. So could you just pinpoint some of these traits of the leaders and comment on their leadership styles? And what influence does it cause on the people?
I think the leadership style to a large extent emerges from where that country is in its progression. So you can't have somebody who's very dominant in a country that is very liberal. You can't go to New Zealand and effectively start taking away people's rights. The people over there will be, what the hell? That's not okay. So you need only somebody like a Jacinda Ardern would be able to get elected in New Zealand, right? In Russia, very liberal person comes in, they'll just get shot by their opponent or whatever it is, because, you need a different kind of canny strategic way of thinking. The oligarchs have taken control. So it's a chess game over there. And I think you've got to go into the historical background of the different countries to understand, okay, where did that culture come from? So a place like China and Russia, we think of them as very authoritarian countries. And, where the leaders are very dominant and the people below are being kind of like subjugated and stuff like that. Why are the people willing to put up with it? I think it's because they suffered the most damage, say, in the World War. So, in China, if you look at the people who actually died, the number of people who died in China as a result of first the Western aggression and then the Japanese aggression, or if you look at the people in Russia, far more Russians died than in Britain or America or France. Like the number of Russians who died is like more than everybody else put together. I don't know the exact numbers, but it's huge, right? So if you have like 20 million people in your country killed, right? You lost your father or your uncle, etc. You're looking for safety. You're looking for somebody who says, I will keep you safe. When you've got like, say, a few 100,000 people in your country have died, you're not as traumatically impacted by that. So people still believe in rights. So where do people become, where do people look for strong men to kind of rule over them is when they feel they need to be protected. Why do people feel they need to be protected? Because of some trauma in the past where people were harmed very badly. So I feel like if you look at all the authoritarian countries, they're countries that have suffered trauma in their history. And because the people are traumatized, they will elect people. And so the leadership style is emerging from the people, and the people's culture is emerging as a result of historic things that have happened in their history, basically. And so I think we're all heading in a certain direction, which is more liberal, progressive, and understanding the values of the Enlightenment. But we're at different places in that journey. Just like, if I had a really traumatic incident as a kid, I would be affected by that. It would take me longer to get over it than somebody who perhaps didn't have that very damaging personal incident. So that's how I see the leadership styles of different people fitting the cultures that they come from. India, I think, is an exception because I think we had people at the beginning, Nehru, Gandhi, Ambedkar, who were 100 years ahead of the population, and the people who fought for independence had to think, okay, we don't have to be like slaves of the British. They were thinking of human rights and freedoms, etc. They were way ahead. The other people who were very hierarchical, the caste systems there, even if I go out on the road and there's some driver who bumps into me, he'll automatically say, sorry, sahab. He doesn't report to me. I'm not his boss. I can't do anything to him. But the deferentialness is just built into society. And so with that sort of level of, the caste system and, imperialism, etc., it is very surprising that the leaders we had were so far ahead of the rest of the population. What we're seeing now with Modi and the rest of these guys, I think, is where we are in terms of education level, poverty level. So we were lucky because the first leaders we had were so humanist and so far ahead of their times that their influence has lasted for a while. I think we're now reverting to what actually we see in Pakistan and Bangladesh and places around us. That is what you expect in African countries and in poorer countries. We've been very lucky until now because of our earlier leaders. Our luck has run out. And now it's really for people like us to say, okay, we need to take it forward. We can't keep saying we've gone backwards. We're actually where, we should be given our education and poverty levels, etc. So we need to take it to the next level. So that's how I see your original question of how do the leadership styles of different people in countries, short answer, depends on the culture of the country. It's emergent property.
If you analyze a lot of humanist leaders, which we have seen in India, for example, like for Gandhi, we have prominent figures like Vivekananda and people who served the society like Mother Teresa, etc. But even then, if you dig into their final personalities, you can see a lot of dark sides which is being projected. So if you're saying that to remain invisible, do we need to remain invisible or actually try to account for it? So these prominent figures might be having some dark sides, and if that is not being accounted and just their humanist sides are being projected, how is that going to work? And could you tell them that they're purely humanistic leaders, or they're natural leaders who also had dark sides? How do you put these leaders?
I think people are complex, and there's no need to say Gandhi, everything he did was fantastic. There's no need to say that. Well, I'm not going to say Hitler, but I'm not going to say. But let's say authoritarian person like Boris Johnson. Like, there's no need to say everything he's doing is necessarily bad. For example, people are complex. I teach a course on ethics in ISB, and we look at some of the people who have got tempted by the dark side, like Rajat Gupta, who was the CEO of McKinsey, and he was the one who started ISB, of course, Indian School of Business. And we look at Ramlingan Raju, who is the head of the founder of Satyam. And if you look at the good things that they've done amazing things. Like the charity work that Satyam has done, the people they put, the struggling people that they put through education, the amount of social work they've done. You'd say the guy is an angel. And then you look at the money that has been siphoned away and the people who are impacted by that and how much they've benefited, etc. You'd say he's a monster. And if you say, well, he's either a monster or he's an angel, I think that's to miss the complexity of humans. Like, I'm neither good nor bad. There's sometimes when I make good decisions. There's sometimes I make bad decisions. There's some nice times when I'm very romantic with my wife. Sometimes I'm a complete ass. So we don't need to put people in one bucket or the other. I think that's simple. We're looking for simplicity. We're looking for certainty. We're looking for easy boxes so we can make decisions. And if we really want to understand nuance, we've got to say, hey, Gandhi had some great ideas, some inspiring ideas. He had some ideas that are not so maybe helpful as well. So, for example, saying, like the Jews should have gone to the Hitler and said, shoot us, and then Hitler would have felt guilty. And so like I have gone to the British and they will eventually satyagraha, speaking truth and honesty, the British will eventually feel guilty and leave. He's saying the Jews should have allowed themselves to be murdered. It doesn't have to be. You don't have to say Gandhi was a great man, so that it must be wisdom in that. You could say Gandhi was a great man, and that's a dumb statement. So I think when you try to put people into a bucket and say, Mother Teresa are perfect or Gandhi are perfect, etc., you deify somebody, even Ambedkar, etc. You deify them, and when you deify something and it makes unquestioning, then people will use your unquestioning worship of religion or country or communism or whatever it is. They will use that to manipulate you because you lose your critical thinking facilities, right? So never question, never deify something and see that it's without flaw. See that people are complex and say, okay, overall, I believe this person did more good than harm. They don't have to be perfect, but I can still be inspired then. And, just because somebody did terribly, a lot of things, killed lots of people doesn't mean, for example, a great example is Lee Kuan Yew. You could look at what he's achieved in Singapore. But in the initial stages, there was suppression of, speech. He did say, you've got to learn English. You've got to move away from Chinese. We've got to become a global company, etc. So there was a lot of, authoritarianism, which is still there, remnant in Singapore. But overall, you say, okay, even though you don't have complete free speech in Singapore, are they earning like $60,000 a day? Everybody's happy. They're flying around, etc. So he caused more good than harm, even though he was authoritarian by many of the liberal Western Nordic standards set. For sure, even though Gandhi was great for India and he's inspired a lot of people, some of his ideas, we can't have industries, for example. Maybe we can't get a prosperous India with, a decent life, prosperity, quality of living, unless we have some capitalism, So this idea of we'll have like 1,000 villages and everybody will have a village community, it may not be relevant. So I think we can be more nuanced and say, I'm inspired by this person, but these are things that I don't agree with. This person was in general a terrible person, and I think these things he did are actually very smart decisions, and I don't think we have to put them in one bucket or the other.
A leader of an organization or a representative leader of a society or the nation will have to take decisions which might go against certain section of the people in most cases, or in some cases. So at that situation, what should the leader do? Should they go forward with a decision which violates the fundamental rights or other rights of a person or a group of persons? Or could he do away without violating a section? So and go against a decision. So how does decision making play around when you have to actually take on a few section of people's liberty?
Let me start the other way around because the answer to that is clearer in my mind. So in a society, in some cases, when you violate human rights, you can get outcomes that justified. That's the the consequentialist way of ethics, school of ethics, saying the ends justify the means, right? So, for example, in Punjab, there was in the 1980s there was a movement from Khalistan, right? They wanted some people wanted a separate country, and for a while there were a lot of Sikhs might have been under suspicion, seen as anti-national, and there was anti-terrorist things. And I'm sure in the process of that, some innocent people were also affected. Some people who weren't linked to terrorists were locked up for speaking about Khalistan, etc., etc. But I would say, even though there probably were violations of fundamental rights over there, now Punjab is a fairly peaceful place. The Sikh community is very much a part of India, respected very strongly for both their intelligence, people like Manmohan, for their heart, for their bravery. You speak about their langar, you speak about the Sikhs fighting in the Indian army, etc. They've got a great reputation, and they're integrated, and there's peace in that, in Punjab, let's say, one of the richest states in India. But it happened after the violence that was there, or maybe some places it went too far. And even in India, India invaded Goa, invaded the king of Mysore, etc. And they said, hey, we are imposing our rule. We'll fight for this. We believe in this. You may have got this land. You may be the rightful king, but we are going to invade because we believe this. And so there may have been a fight. There may have been war. In the end, I think the result of those states, Mysore being part of India, has created long-term. They've integrated. They're stable. They're part. So in some places it works. And in some places like Kashmir, for example, I don't think it's working. So, over there, it's exacerbating the situation, creating further tensions, etc. And that judgment call, is Kashmir like Punjab? If we keep doing what we did in Punjab and Kashmir, will it eventually stabilize? Clearly, the BJP team thinks it's possible. And they've got the Punjab example. I would say no, because the demographics are too different. They've got a Muslim nation next to it, who a lot of people who will support these people. Independence. Punjab by itself was slightly different. So I think you can find situations in both cases where authoritarianism in the short term for a number of people created better results in the long term than letting that situation fester. And that's, of course, the Chinese philosophy, saying stability is the most important thing. If you don't use some authority to get stability, the constant, fighting for dominance, etc., will create a much worse, wars than if we push some stability using some force. And of course, there are places where people have gone too far. So it's a judgment call, and each person will have their own point of view. I think at this time, you got to make a judgment call, saying, neither can you say no, no force is possible at all. That may not be practical. And also there's an extreme where you say, hey, that is just completely unacceptable. Where you draw that line is a very subjective thing. I'll have my point of view. You'll probably have a slightly different line. We're probably more similar than somebody who's more authoritarian. So I don't think there's a right answer to that. China has a very authoritarian thing. India has had a very democratic constitution for a while, and yet their GDP is, like 8 trillion, ours is 2 trillion. So they're earning like some 4 times. They've got an average salary of some $10,000. Ours is about $2,500 or something like that. So even within that, the quality of life and the peace and stability within China as a result of that is actually perhaps better than our system. I personally prefer the Indian democratic system to that authoritarianism. Even if I was to earn more in that system, the freedom of speech, etc., that we've had, I prefer that. But I cannot say that for sure is right, because somebody else could argue hey, I would prefer prosperity. And Singaporean, for example, I'm okay not writing my thoughts on a blog if I'm earning $60,000 compared to $2,000 in India. I'm willing to make that sacrifice. So everybody will have a different point of view on that, I think.
Do you think that there should be a benchmark on the educational level of the leaders, especially in this data-rich environment where most of the decisions are taken on the basis of data, science and data? So do you think the leaders, the politically elected leaders, should have a basic threshold of education to be handling our states, federal states, and the nation? So where does that count?
The two schools of thought is, if you say, hey, there's a minimum level of education, and this is what Plato said. Plato said, hey, you know what? Only philosophers should be allowed to become leader. You should have 50 years of philosophy training, and then you should become a philosopher king. Because if you let the people decide, uneducated people, they will make stupid decisions. And the thing that really pissed him off was the killing of Socrates. So Socrates was his teacher, and he was teaching stuff that was very advanced and challenged the local norms. The uneducated masses were very upset, and they killed him. And so Plato said, you should not have uneducated people making decisions. They are just a mob, basically, and in the democracy will always devolve into a mob, because it's the large numbers, and the large numbers are uneducated compared to the elite. So that was his argument. But on the other side, where you have seen people, the elites rule, you get aristocracy, right? You have that in the ancient Roman empires, the ancient Greek empires, where a small group of rich families, very well educated, they hold all the power, they make all the decisions. And logically you say, hey, they would make better decisions, except that they start making decisions that benefit them. They start making a very elite sort of decision. So instead of investing money to make sure that everybody gets rice, they might say, let's invest in a great art museum, etc. So there's a danger to saying, okay, only have educated people and they will make good decisions because that's the elite crowd, and they will make decisions that benefit themselves at the cost of the poor people. And if poor people can't have representation in politics, then there's going to be increasing divide, etc., self-interested elites. But then if you have democracy, you have mob rule, and eventually, I think democracy is a terrible system. It's just better than every other system. So that's the famous saying, that there are a lot of problems with democracy. Having uneducated people run for office is a problem. Of course, they don't have the ability to make the decisions, but saying you cannot be at this place, you have to have the decision, leaves like 90%, 50% of the population, who are perhaps the people who most need representation, to look after them. So again, a trade-off, but I would prefer to, have a democratic system where we say, okay, we'll make a decision. You don't have to have a degree. People like Richard Branson, they failed their A-levels, etc. You have, maybe Dhirubhai Ambani, perhaps, who I'm not sure what his education was. My understanding, he was a Gujarati trader. Perhaps he couldn't even speak English, etc. And so you have lots of multi-billionaires who dropped out of college, who don't have a great college, but they're very capable. And so democracy allows people to say, hey, he may not have that degree, but I believe he's honest. I believe that, he's capable. I think he's got life learning. And so I'm willing to trust him to make decisions. And that has disadvantages. But I would prefer that system rather than saying only the educated people can get in.
In the current scenario, we have a lot of people posing as godmen. We have a lot of godmen in our country. It is not just confined to our country. We have evangelist godmen in other nations as well. So a lot of people pose as godmen, and they actually tend to set up an unscientific thought propagation and an example for their followers. So how do you view this particular set of leadership and followership, where the number of followers following a single person is very, very huge? So is it the right kind of leadership for the modern day times, and where do you believe this should end, or should this fit in terms of the society?
Yeah, I think it is not as good as having non-frauds, let me say, people who pretend to be enlightened, etc. It will obviously be better. But the reason people are going to these guys is because the alternative doesn't exist. And a lot of the reason I think that people go to godmen is because they get something from that they're not getting it from any other place. Peace of mind, guidance, assurance, a way forward, etc. And the liberals like me have been in our rooms reading our internet and watching Game of Thrones, and we have been living our lives based on what is good for us. Never going to Dharavi slums and kind of like saying, hey, let me do a career workshop for you guys. So if I go to Dharavi workshop and do a career workshop, people will look to me and say, hey, that guy is somebody I trust. That guy inspires me. He's willing to take time. I'm willing to listen to what he says. But if the liberal atheists are in our rooms watching Game of Thrones and the religious godmen are there saying, come to me and I will tell you how to live your life and I will look after you, they're going to go to that alternative. So rather than saying, hey, these guys are frauds, I've got to look at myself and saying, am I putting myself in a place where these people have an alternative? If I'm not, I can't really say anything about that. And I think a lot of the people who are going to religion is because liberals have effectively, seceded from the rest of the nation, and they're living in their own, first world bubble. That's right. I have my gym, etc. And if we really want to change the country, we've got to provide. We've got to put ourselves in place where we can help these people. We've got to put ourselves, invest our time, invest our money, be there for their welfare. The thing that religious people have, religious leaders have, they are very strongly passionate about this is the way the world should be. This is what was good for our country. And that inspires people. I'm like, I'll do what is convenient for me. I'll go to Starbucks. I'm not going to go there and go on my weekend and like volunteer at a school. So yes, religious leaders are not taking us forward. But if we are to go forward, we've got to step into that space instead of complain about what they're doing.
Last few decades, right, especially when capitalism took off and the neoliberal economy took off in last few decades, that we have a drastic inequality in the society, right?
Yeah.
It's been told like the median, the inflation-adjusted median income for people in the US is almost same as what we had in 1978.
Right.
At the same time, the rich, probably the 1% of the rich, which earned like more than 650% of what they were used to earn in 1970s. So
yeah.
I've heard three types of arguments on this one. There are people who talk about like the neoliberalism is at a dead end.
Yeah.
The other set of people who talk about capitalism is quite resilient and could overcome these challenges. The third perspective is normally from the technological side, because we are moving ahead with the technological disruption with AI and robotics and things like that, and we are moving to a demonetized world where money is not going to be that important as of what we see today.
Yeah.
So where do you see the world is going to be ending up in terms of the economic model?
Both those arguments are true. Both of them are true, and they're both going to live with each other forever. And I think this is a dynamic that has existed in society forever. I mean, you look at ancient Greeks, and if you read the history, there are always these slave revolts. You look at the Roman history, there are these revolts with the plebeians against the patricians, etc. So there's been, Spartacus and the slave revolts. So the French Revolution. So right from like 500 BC at least, which is the Greeks, you have stories about people rising against the people who are ruling them, saying you guys are taking too much money. But eventually the rich people will, reinstate their power because, we live in a place where hierarchy makes things more structured and creates prosperity. Again, it'll become unequal. Again, you'll get a revolution. Again, there'll be a new power elite who will take power and they will build that inequality. And again, you'll get it collapsing. So I think we're going to keep going through cycles like this again and again. And just like you had the French Revolution, like where the peasants came in and killed the king and queen, you'd say the king and queen had all the resources to keep the power. They had the soldiers, etc. But the rebels were able to kill that, right? Similarly, like now you say, hey, because of technology, you'll have like a growing inequality because, one robot, the guy who owns the robot technology can do the job of like 1,000 people, but these guys can come and smash your warehouse and kill that CEO, etc. So I think, or vote somebody in who changes the tax laws or makes this, impossible, etc. So I think you will get inequality going up, sudden change, up, sudden change, etc. And I think that's been going on for the last, 2,500 years at the very least. China, you have these peasant revolts. In Germany, you have these peasant revolts, etc. In places like India, you had the tribals fighting against Ashoka, who was trying to implement his views. They wanted the use of the forest. So you're going to keep getting this dynamic forever. And I think in the short term, so long term, for me, if that's 2,500 years of inequality going up and down and up and down, my guess is that's a pretty, a fundamental pattern that's going to continue. But in the short term, the levels of inequality we have just now are almost the same levels that we had in the French Revolution. I don't think it's going to change immediately, because when I listen to people, I hear the poor people who would be most affected, most benefited by the rich paying more taxes, for example. They're not talking about taxes. They're talking about caste, religion, representation, my state, etc. So they're not talking about taxes. They are talking about identity politics, right? The rich people very few people are going to talk about it, because in their worldview, there's like, we have made our money through meritocracy. Meritocracy creates a great world. And so they are not going to question that system. They're the ones who benefit most. Apart from the Buffett and Gates, etc., you have 1 or 2 billionaires who are, we need to do more of our share. The vast majority of billionaires are going to say that. And the weird thing is the middle class, which is therefore where the change could potentially come from. It's not going to come from the poor because they're like worried about religion. It's not going to come from the rich because it's their interest to keep the system going. The middle class are not saying we need to change the system. It's a very small minority of leftist intellectuals. The most of them that I hear, at least from my MBA schools, etc., they're like, hey, we need billionaires. If you tax more, that's communist, etc. So the biggest supporters of the current system is actually the educated middle class, saying you've got to have capitalism for prosperity. And I don't understand why they're not looking at the Nordic model, because that clearly, for me, seems to be the best model in the world. And they've got high tax rates, and they're saying we provide education and healthcare to every single person, world quality, because everybody is educated, they know their rights, and you can't get that sort of, subjugation, exploitation. So for some reason, we are not looking at that model, and we're looking at, failed communist Russia. And the argument is, if you tax the billionaires, entrepreneurship will go down. And it's not just the billionaires saying it, it's people who are earning, 10 lakhs, people who are earning 20 lakhs in a year. They're the ones who are most steadfastly arguing. So I don't see it changing just now. Next 5 years, I don't see it changing. But let's see, now you've got like people like Piketty, the economist who's written about, the wealth inequalities, etc. Even magazines like The Economist are talking about welfare. They're talking about, minimum basic income, etc. So maybe these ideas will filter up, and I don't know if it's going to be 10 years or 20 years, or maybe it's going to be promoted just now. But at the moment, the conversation I'm hearing, it's only a small bunch of intellectuals who are really talking about we need to change the tax systems. Most people are talking about, should France have the veil or not have the veil? Should we have Ayodhya? Should, what is Kangana doing? So the real solution to global problems today, I feel, is taxation. It's got to be more taxes for the rich, invested in education and healthcare for the poor, but nobody's looking at that solution.
Professionally, you have a leadership trainer. So you are giving training, so you have to accept the hierarchy.
Yes.
Correct. So in leadership, you have to accept the hierarchy. So how will it will differentiate as a Democrat personnel? We have ideology like communism, socialism, everything is very popular, very, very high popular. Why India is accepting communal majority politics over this very well popular communism and socialism? Is rejected. Indians are rejecting the communism and populism and accepting the communal majority policy. What your view about this?
We have our own company. There are 4 of us in the company. And because we don't report to anybody, we pick the clients that we want to work with. And, they're usually companies that are closer to our value system. So until now, for example, we haven't worked with ITC because I don't smoke. We haven't worked with Reliance. Maybe we will one day, but until now, I just haven't felt comfortable. So I work with the companies that I feel comfortable with, and I'm lucky enough to be in a position where I can afford to do that because financially we're okay. So we can make those choices. And because we're earning okay, we can pick and choose who we work with. And if we're not enjoying working with somebody, we can go, we can pick a different client. So we're lucky in that. But other people, I'm not judging other people who are not in that position where they can make those choices. They will do what's available to them. We have more choices. But again, I think it's not about changing the entire system. I think it's about being pragmatic. In my choices, I'm not going to change the democratic system of India. What I can do is with the people in my workshop, I can perhaps have conversations that will help them, become more effective in their lives, both in the professional and personal space. And as they become more confident about their ability to do things, they are less likely to seek that, validation from group identity and be therefore swayed by group identity politics. So one of the things that I've found is in my ethics classes, when people are talking about unethical actions of some other people, they say that is a bad person, they did this bad thing. When they're talking about their own choices, they say, I had no choice. I had to do this. My boss said this. So they never say to that person, oh, he did it because he didn't have a choice. They say he did it because he was a bad person. When they're talking about themselves, they say, I would have liked to have done the right thing. I would have liked to have done the right thing, but I could not, or I had to. So when we build people's confidence in themselves to achieve the outcomes, then instead of saying, I have no choice, there's nothing I can do, I have to do it, they say, you know what, I do have a choice. If I get sacked from this job, I'm a capable person. I'll get a job in other places. So building people's confidence allows them to be more ethical, and allowing them to be more ethical allows us slowly to build, a better world. But it's a small drop in the ocean, and my job is not to change the ocean. It's just to add that small drop. So in that respect, I'm happy with what I do. I want to look at how I can expand it, but I'm not feeling bad that, I'm not doing everything because I don't have that. I used to think that I could change everything, but I found that was very tiring. So it's about limiting my ambition, which is a conversation I had a little bit earlier. This is what I can do at work. Let me do what I can do where I can. With respect to why India is not going towards the more, the more left side of things, if we're going more to the right wing religious, I think these are accidents of history. So in countries where there is a large number of poor people, you're either going to go to the leaders who want to mobilize masses. Well, there are three options. You either mobilize the rich people, get their money, and then use that money to convince everybody else everything is fine. That's one route. Or you mobilize the poor people, and the two ways of mobilizing them, one is through religion, which we say in the Islamic world, in India, any place where there's a large number of religious people. In the place where the religion is not as high, the way you can get the hold of poor people, uneducated people, superstitious people is, hey, we poor people against the rich people. The rich people have been exploiting you. You be on our side, we will kick out the rich people and we will look after you. But then in that case, they have new bosses who are exploiting them in different ways. China has a background of Confucianism and, Tao, which were more philosophical sort of value system. So Confucius never spoke about God, So a lot of the Chinese are more about philosophy and they're looking at logic. And so the communist system appeals to them in that sense because they're talking about this is why the world would be a better place. And the poor, this is how the rich have been exploiting the poor against rich is the argument that has worked over here. In India, for a very long time, we didn't have the agnostic philosophers. We had the more religious kind of background with the Hinduism and the Vedas, and that's what has been our cultural background. And so people are more likely to be moved by that. Again, the Islamic world has had that. So I think where we currently are in terms of which countries are going for Islamism, which countries are going for communism, which countries are going for religious Hinduism or Christianity, etc. The people who went to America were the most religious people who were persecuted for their faith in Europe. So they were not, fitting in. So they went there. So the most religious people who were most passionate about their religion, and they felt that their religion wasn't being allowed to, flourish in Ireland or UK, etc. They went to America. And so that's the foundation of America, a lot of very religious people. And of course, Western, right since the Enlightenment period or the Renaissance period, there's been a critical thought. So we are products of our history. We are choosing the things because of long societal culture that has been built up in these different societies. And now that the internet is connecting different people and we're getting a sense of how different people are handling and our eyes are opening up, slowly I think the best system will filter, which I personally believe is the democratic, liberal, scientific temperament. So I think slowly that'll come, but we are where we are because of our past. And I'm talking about 2,000 years or 4,000 years ago for us.
Understand when you talk about the linkage of religion and politics of a nation. So India casteism being so deep-rooted, topped up by parties like BJP, there. But how do you see the impact of religion, if there is, how much it is in corporate worlds as such? And how can a corporate leader, what can a corporate leader do to remove those barriers and improve team performance? Because you have worked in corporate trainings also.
I haven't seen religion showing up in the corporate world in the companies that I work with. So the companies that I work with are usually, multinationals like Unilever, Goldman Sachs, the Indian School of Business, etc. The conversation, I have never seen caste mentioned over there. I have very rarely seen religion being mentioned. There are a few traditional Indian, business houses where you might have that, wo Muslim hai, the Muslim, etc. You might have that when they're speaking with somebody else, but from a hiring point of view, I have never seen that personally come up. I've been in a lot of interviews for the last 10 years for ISB. I've interviewed for Hindustan Levers. I've been at a lot of coffee table conversations. In the MNCs, I don't hear it. And I know there's a very vociferous group of people who say, hey, casteism is endemic and it's, religion is made in all decisions. I haven't seen it in the MNC world, which is where I do my world, and I haven't seen it at the top Indian corporates, at the top educated people. They may have their biases when voting for a politician, but at work, you do have, different people, and people, when they're looking at profits, ultimately they're going to pick the people who are best. The people who are picking over religion and caste instead of who's the most capable people are the more traditional Indian houses, a little bit lower down. I haven't seen it at the top levels, which is where I do most of my work personally.
Talking about the culture that is there, that people generally use words like I should rather than I can, I want to. So yeah. I think you also said that religion probably has a role to play in that.
Yeah.
So do you see that is affecting people to give their 100% in corporate life as well, in MNCs as well, or there is no link?
Well, they give it in terms of effort. So I would say, religious people give 100% of effort because they believe it's their duty. They have a whole bunch of, code of ethics, etc. So they work very hard. There's no doubt about that. The problem is if they're very good at following orders. And so I think that shows up in a culture of hierarchy and doing what you're told unquestioningly and working very hard, not making a mistake, but not thinking out of the box, not thinking innovatively. And so the ideas that you're getting in America, for example, they'll generate the iPad, the internet, lasers, etc. You're not going to see them coming really out from India. What we will do is we will copy things that have been done elsewhere for an Indian context, or we will try to make it efficient. We are famous for doing, basic coding. We are famous for doing back-end work. That is where we're building our strength. We are not known for innovation, right? So when is India going to come up with a company like Samsung or Apple, etc.? I don't know. Even when you see Reliance coming into the market with, their Zoom copycat product, exactly the same look, so everything that we're producing here is a copy, whether you're producing, like Uber is doing it, let's do that in India with Ola. Okay. Amazon is doing it. Let's do that in India with Flipkart. So we're copying models and implementing them in India, but there's very little innovation or creativity. And I think that is a price that we're paying for our religious orthodoxy, not from a lack of hard work. It's just we're doing grunt work. And I think until we break those mindsets, we can't have an innovation mindset. We can't have a research and technology, because that's like at the cutting edge of questioning what we know, questioning what we believe. You can't do that with, I think, a very religious mindset.
Right.
I think eventually there's plenty of space, because earlier, India was shackled by the license Raj and, like the whole bunch of bureaucracy and a lack of, integration of the world economy. So now that has been removed since 1991, there's been a lot of space to grow for the rich people, because there's a huge market that they can exploit, so they can become richer and bigger without necessarily doing anything innovative. Take their ideas from outside, implement it over here, and because of that market, we can grow, and we can keep growing for like a few decades. There's going to be a certain point where the balance between what is possible will just grunt work and the imports of better products or better global competition, we reach our limit, and then our GDP is going to plateau. In order to then get over that, you will have a few people who are innovative and who create cultures where the people are innovative. They will be the ones who get to the next level. The ones who can't innovate will die, and it's evolution. So over a period of time, that innovation will come when we're forced into no other option. But at the moment, there's enough space to grow without innovation, so there's no pressure on creating that critical thinking mindset at the moment, I feel.
So Kanishka, this is about the technological disruption the world is seeing, like in terms of artificial intelligence, robotics, and things like that. So it's been discussed like almost 60 to 70% of the jobs would be replaced by either of these technology in the coming years.
Yeah.
Now, the question is, how is it going to impact the world, especially India, because India has been seen a surge in terms of middle class progress in last few years, especially because of more multinational companies, globalization per se. So, but then what our advantage was, like we have a very large young population compared to the other countries.
Yeah.
But then when the technology is going to replace a lot of jobs, how is India going to place itself as a competitive country in the world?
We don't have a manufacturing base that much, so the technology is really going to make the robots and stuff are going to do a lot of replacement of that. But in India, the labor is so cheap, so a lot of the agriculture, etc., service. So where are people cheap? They're going to do service and they're going to do farming, but they won't go into manufacturing, because if you can do a robot much more efficiently and cheaper, and we don't have the systems over here, we don't have those jobs to lose so much. I think it's going to stay for a while, but we're seeing some of the problems of that, what you're saying right now, because now we've hit this COVID thing. So many people are losing their jobs. Where they're going to go? There's really no answer. Actually, I'm struggling, because this is one of the topics that I gave to my my students at ISB. I said, hey, I teach business communication. So I said, write a report on how we're going to create jobs in India. And I thought, okay, if I read the reports of like 800 people, I'll get some ideas. And people are stuck, because you can't change the farming's thing. The reason that farming is so difficult to make more productive, is because everybody has small land holdings. You can only make your land holdings productive if you have large land holdings like they have in America. Big farms, you have tractors, you have that. When you have a small farms, each farmer has their own pit. They're going to do it manual. The yields are never going to go up. And if you try to change laws that allow people to purchase large pieces of land, people are going to protest. They're going to say, hey, you know what, you're making it easier for large landholders to take over. So there's going to be a lot of reaction to that, and we can't move to that. The question is, what would happen to those poor people who give up their farming? The only way they can give farming is find a job in manufacturing, right? But you can't have jobs in manufacturing because our labor laws are very stringent. They say, and because of actually communism in a certain way, you're not allowed to fire anybody in Indian factories, right? It's very, very difficult. So people are afraid that if we hire a lot of people and the demand goes down, we won't be able to pay them. So the way around that is we won't even hire them. We'll have them on contract basis, or they won't be our employees. So they're not fixed permanent jobs that people can hire when the business goes up or sack when it goes down. It's very inflexible, right? So because of that, people are not willing to hire. And there's a lot of laws saying that if you're more than 100 people or 10 people in manufacturing, extra laws make it very hard to operate. So people just keep it a small size. Again, they don't have the efficiency. So the people cannot move out of farming until the labor laws change, and they can't move into manufacturing because there's no jobs, and those jobs won't be created until you create more flexibility. And you can't create more flexibility because the flexibility makes jobs in the short term more easy to get rid of, sacking more easy. So the laborers are going to, in the short term, say, hey, no, people will just sack us. So we won't allow that. But because they're not allowing people to get sacked, the people who don't have jobs, who might have got jobs, are being left out by effectively the people who do have jobs and don't want to take the risk that it could go on. So that is kind of there are lots of bottlenecks over there. And the third place where you're going to get jobs is the service or the innovation industry. But again, because our orientation is so not innovation based, you're not going to get huge growth that is going to drive there. So In the innovation space, the high tech space, we don't have the innovativeness there. In the manufacturing space, we don't have the flexibility to expand there. And in the in the land, we can't move them out into manufacturing. If we can't move them out, they're going to remain as farmers. If we have a lot of farmers, it's going to be small land holdings that cannot be productive. So we're really stuck just now. I don't have an answer. I don't know anybody who does have an answer. I haven't read anything in all those reports that say, oh, this is what we need to do. I think where we start is saying, how do we create a greater scientific temper? Scientific temper, pushing for more taxes, education of people, freedom of, more education means people will understand what needs to be done. They will vote for people who want the right things. Vote for right people, then we can start making the tougher decisions, because people understand why it needs to be done, short-term pain, long-term gain. So really it's the root solution is educating people to think logically and scientifically rather than based on irrelevant factors like religion itself. I think it emerges from that. The prosperity of countries emerges from the foundation of the culture education system. That's where long-term we're going to get prosperity. There's not a single bullet that you can shoot and say, oh, if we invest in this business, things will happen. They won't, because the underlying cultural, the base, that needs to be different for this to emerge. The economy and prosperity are very emergent, top layer things. They all emerge from the culture. That's where we got to work. And, if I was to say one last thing over here, it's people like us have got to go and find ways of helping people to move up. We've got to volunteer our time. We've got to make ourselves available to help people. So people look at it and say, hey, I want to think like this person, as opposed to I'm watching Game of Thrones and that religious person who's going and giving them advice, they're saying, I want to be like this guy. So we've got to put ourselves out there if we want the rest of the people to look in this direction and want to be this way, if you know what I mean.